Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first session with Planet Word. My name is Katie, and I work with EF Education First, and I'll be your moderator for this session. This one is Inaugural Speeches, The Power and Potential of Words. This session is presented by the one and only Caitlin Miller, who is joining us from Planet Word. And as your moderator, I'll help keep an eye on the chat. And although I'll be off screen for pretty much the rest of this presentation, I'll be accessible in the chat. And so with that, it's my absolute pleasure to pass it over to Caitlin, and welcome. So with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me into your homes and classrooms. My name is Caitlin Miller. I am an education manager at Planet Word, which is a brand new museum in Washington, D.C. This is Planet Word right here. You can see a picture of our building. We are the newest museum to open in Washington, D.C., and we are dedicated to renewing and inspiring a love of words, language, and reading through unique, immersive learning experiences. At Planet Word, you can use digital paintbrushes to change a scene depending on what descriptor word you choose. You can use iPads to learn from native speakers of 30 different languages, what makes those languages unique and special. You can visit our magical library and see books come to life and try to hunt for our secret poetry nook. And you can also visit the word wall and learn all about what makes the English language special, unique, how it got to be the way it is, and all the different cultural influences that changed it. You can go to our expo page to learn more about what you can see and do at Planet Word if you're interested, and I do hope that one day you'll be able to come and visit us in person. And in the meantime, please check out our website to learn about educator resources and adult learning and all the things we offer online. But most relevant today, in our Lend Me Your Ears gallery, it is your turn to make your voice heard. Here, you can discover what made famous speeches immortal and try delivering them yourselves using a teleprompter. One of the speeches featured in our gallery is President John F. Kennedy's famous 1961 inaugural address. In short, at Planet Word, we believe that literacy, which by that we mean reading, listening, and thinking about the complex meanings behind the words we hear and use every day, is the foundation of a strong democracy. Inauguration Day, today, is a moment that Americans can take to reflect on what it means to live in a democracy and what our role is in preserving it. Every president, starting with George Washington, has delivered an inaugural address, which is a speech given as part of the ceremonies surrounding the taking of an oath of office. Some were long, some were short, some were just delivered to members of Congress, and some were given to the broader public on the steps of the United States Capitol. So let's take a break for a quick fun fact. The shortest inaugural address was only 135 words long. Who delivered it? What do you think? Do we have a poll we can launch, Katie, or is it best to have everyone just respond in the chat? All right, looks like it's best for everyone just to respond in the chat. I'd love to see who you think delivered the shortest inaugural address. Yeah, let's have everyone throw it in the chat. That's great. I can see we've got one answer, one guess in the chat from Connie. Thank you for jumping in. Wonder if anyone else wants to jump in and guess. All right, we have two competing guesses. One person thinks George Washington, one person thinks Abraham Lincoln. Wonder if anybody else wants to weigh in. I'll give you like 5 more seconds. Garfield, ooh, another excellent guess here. All right, you guys, Thank you for weighing in there. The correct answer is George Washington. George Washington's second inaugural address was short and sweet. Okay. I wonder if you have ever heard any of these phrases before. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The better angels of our nature. The American experiment. Or ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I bet you have heard of them. They were all used in inaugural addresses, often by presidents, seeking to heal divisions within the country or inspire its citizens to overcome challenges. Inaugural addresses are a chance for the incoming president to speak to the country about the challenges we face, what they hope to achieve during their term in office, and their vision for our nation's future. Incoming presidents use their speeches to shape the nation's character and influence the actions and beliefs of its citizens. As we have seen in recent days, the words of the President of the United States can shake the world. Inaugural speeches can be described by many words: galvanizing, hopeful, maybe boring. I know some of you out there might be thinking that, but they aren't accidental. Every speech has been carefully crafted and thoughtfully written, in recent years by teams of speechwriters, including the one we saw today. When you listen closely, you'll hear that speechwriters and the presidents who deliver them employ time-tested techniques for effective public speaking. So if you slow down and listen closely, you can identify these techniques and use them yourself when you're making your own points. Together, we'll spend the next 20 minutes or so analyzing and reflecting on President Joe Biden's inaugural address and try to pull apart some of the techniques of writing and delivery that we just witnessed. I hope many of you had a chance to watch the inaugural address. I'll do my best to share some that the team at Planet Word noticed, and I hope that you will do the same in the chat. Join in with me and help me find examples of some of these techniques. So as we get started, I just want to encourage you guys, this was the prompt from the beginning. What is one word from President Biden's speech that stood out to you? What did you notice? All right, I see several people in the chat responding before and now. We noticed white supremacy, we noticed democracy, we noticed the word unity being really emphasized. Thank you guys for jumping in there. Definitely things we noticed a great deal. And as we go through this, I just want to encourage everyone to be thinking about what stood out to you when listening to Biden's speech. What themes, what techniques, and please jump in and share in the chat. Let's make it a conversation as much as we can. So one technique that we noticed or that we wanted to point out is dramatic pauses, taking a pause, a break in speaking for clarity or emphasis. I don't have a specific example because that's kind of hard to show in text, but when you listen to the speech, you hear a lot of pauses for applause or for effect. And I also think it's important in this moment to point out that President Biden has been very forthcoming about the fact that he overcame a childhood stutter, a childhood speech impediment. And one of the ways he has done this is by learning tips and techniques to help create a rhythm or a pattern in his speech delivery. And he's been vocal about the fact that one of the things that he does in his speeches is put pauses for breaths, so that he kind of can chunk out the speech. So something you might look at or think about if you go back and listen to the speech again today is if you notice any of those pauses, those really helpful strategies to make sure that he was able to deliver this speech today. Another technique we noticed many examples of are direct quotations, repeating words originally written or said by someone else. So here's an example. Generally, unless I give an attribute for the quote, it was from the inaugural address that we just saw with Joe Biden. So he said, in another January, on another New Year's Day in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. When he put pen to paper, the president said, and I quote, "If my name ever goes down in history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." My whole soul is in it. Today, on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation. So this is just one example of a quotation that we noticed, but there were several in this speech, many direct quotations. So I'm curious if anybody noticed any other that they would like to share, any specific quotations. And another thing we can do in this moment is think about what is the benefit in an inaugural address of connecting to specific quotations. Why would a president choose to connect their words to the words of someone else who came before them? Another technique we saw many examples of is allusion, a reference to a significant person, place, or thing. So, for example, we heard the quote, "The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer," which is an allusion to the Langston Hughes poem, "What Happens to a Dream Deferred." It's another example of connecting to the words or the ideas that have come before. This is just one example. There were several allusions in this speech. Oh, thanks, Liz. I really appreciate you jumping in the chat. Not sure if this is a specific quotation exactly, but he mentioned, "as my mom always says." So he's referencing the words of his mother, making a personal connection as well. I love that. Thank you for pointing that out. So through quotations and through allusion, we saw President Biden connecting his language to the language of great thinkers before him. Another pattern that we saw many, many times in this speech, another strategy, is the technique of repetition, repeating the same word or phrase to reinforce its meaning. So, for example, if we look at this quote from the inaugural address we just witnessed, "Here we stand in the shadow of the Capitol dome," as was mentioned earlier, completed amid the Civil War when Union itself was literally hanging in the balance. "Here we stand, looking out on the Great Mall where Dr. King spoke of his dream. Here we stand where 108 years ago at another inaugural, thousands of protesters tried to block brave women marching for the right to vote. Here we stand across the Potomac, across from Arlington Cemetery, where heroes who gave the last full measure of devotion rest in eternal peace. And here we stand just days after a riotous mob thought they could use violence to silence the will of the people, to stop the work of our democracy, to drive us from this sacred ground." We're seeing repetition over and over again. Here is another example. With unity, we can do great things, important things. We can right wrongs. We can put people to work in good jobs. We can teach our children in safe schools. We can overcome the deadly virus. We can reward work and rebuild the middle class and make healthcare secure for all. We can deliver racial justice, and we can make America once again the leading force for good in the world. So once again, we hear this repetition, repeating these phrases over and over again. Oh, and Lily, thanks for jumping into the chat. I really appreciate that. "America, America, I gave my best to you." That's another quote that we saw. Absolutely. We will get through this together. I'm sure you guys are noticing, but what is the word that President Biden chose to repeat over and over and over again? We see unity. I also noticed the word "we," right? We can, here we stand. He made the point of using the word many, many times, which, as Connie is pointing out in the chat, is connecting to this idea of unity, which was a theme of his speech. So we see him using this technique of repetition to underline his theme and bring that forth in the words that he chose. There are several other techniques that we saw used today to pretty good effect. One of them is parallelism, which is repeating similar grammatical structures to add symmetry. So one example that jumped out to us was, "For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhausting outrage. No nation, only a state of chaos." So we have the structure of parallelism with no and only, no and only, no and only, repeated for symmetry and for greater effect, making this contrast. We also saw chiasmus, which is one of my favorites, which is when you repeat a phrase and then you reverse the order on the second way through. So we'll lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. So we take that same phrase and we reverse the order to make a little bit of a word puzzle and drive our point home further. Oh, Connie, you loved that one in particular? How come? Oh, yeah, more people, absolutely. It's also worth pointing out that I believe that this speech, this phrase has been used before in other speeches by presidents. I believe in our conversation before we were thinking that it might have been used by Bill Clinton. So feel free, you guys, as you go through to point out if you've like, oh, I've heard that one before, someone else used that, you know, put your knowledge into the chat too. Oh, and Liz, yes, I can say it again, chiasmus. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about another technique. One is imagery, descriptive language related to one of the five senses. So one example where I noticed that imagery was connecting to this idea of climate change. A cry of survival comes from the planet itself, a cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. Connecting the idea of climate change to a cry that we can hear is an example of imagery. And you might have noticed some other examples of imagery as well. You might have also noticed some metaphors, a comparison between two things that helps to describe an abstract idea. So for example, we can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. The idea of listening and compromising being lowering the temperature is of course a metaphor. That's not literal. We're not going to change the setting on the thermostat, right? But it's used to good effect in this speech. Another thing we saw today was contrast, comparing two different ideas that are not alike. We must end this uncivil war that pits red against blue, rural against urban, conservative versus liberal. We can do this if we open our souls instead of hardening our hearts. That's contrasting different factions, allegiances, words we might use to describe ourselves. I don't know if you noticed any other examples of contrast in the speech you may have. Actually, before I move on to personal pledge, I do want to point out one other thing. There were several techniques that we didn't see very many examples of today. Oh, someone in the chat earlier, let me see if I can find it. Liz Alexander, you pointed out the idea of President Biden referencing something that his mom said. President Biden in other speeches is well known for using personal anecdotes, but we didn't see very many personal anecdotes in this speech today. I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about why President Biden and his speechwriters might have chosen not to put very many personal anecdotes and instead lean on techniques like repetition, like allusion and quotations. Why would a president choose to avoid the personal? Something we might think about. Another thing we didn't see very many examples of, we saw a few examples of metaphor, not very many similes, but we avoided a lot of flowery language. It was a pretty literal speech. Oh, Mike, I really appreciate this point in the chat. Personal anecdotes may not have served his goal of emphasizing the power of we. I think that's a great theory. Thank you for suggesting that. Okay. Another feature of many inaugural addresses that we will see, the president has just taken an oath of office, which is a pledge. So they often use the inaugural address as an opportunity to make more personal pledges, a commitment by the speaker to take actions. And we saw several of those today from President Biden. For example, excuse me, my fellow Americans, I close today where I began. With the sacred oath before God and all of you, I give you my word. I will always level with you. I will defend the Constitution. I'll defend our democracy. I'll defend America, and I'll give all of you, keep everything I do in your service, thinking not of power, but of possibilities, not of personal interest, but the public good. And something that you might see in inaugural addresses, a personal pledge and connecting the oath of office to what that means to them. You might have noticed any other examples of personal pledges. But along with personal pledges, you will often find in inaugural addresses calls to action, asking the audience to do something specific. So we saw that today too. Today, at this time, in this place, let's, again, that concept of we, start afresh, all of us. Let's begin to listen to one another again, hear one another, see one another, show respect to one another. It's a call to action that President Biden wanted to use his speech to connect to all of the people listening. I'm curious, when we were here, did anybody notice any particular calls to action that resonated with them in this speech? And that kind of leads me to taking a moment. We've talked through a ton of techniques. I dumped a lot on you really quickly. We saw not a lot of choice to go with personal anecdotes, but many quotes, many allusions, many uses of repetition of the word we. We saw some metaphor, we saw some imagery a little bit, we saw chiasmus and parallelism. So from that, what stood out to you when listening to Biden's speech and when reflecting on the techniques that President Biden used today? Did anything resonate as we thought about the different techniques that Biden and his speechwriters used? This call to action stood out to me, and we must reject the culture in which facts themselves are manipulated and even manufactured. I think that's a direct quote. Thank you, Lily. Wonderful, you guys. So while you're thinking about that, it's a big question that we might spend several hours pondering if we wanted to. I wanted to try something else, kind of on my way out of the program. First of all, let's do another quick poll check-in with you guys, and you can respond in the chat. At age 43, John F. Kennedy became the youngest person to be elected president of the United States. Do you know who the oldest was? Do you know who the oldest person was to be elected president of the United States? All right, Mike's got it. It is Biden. Yes, Biden is 78 years old, which, as I was preparing for this, I thought about that. He has lived through the administrations of 13 different presidents, all the way back to FDR. So a lot of personal experience to relate to. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the program that John F. Kennedy's speech, inaugural address in 1961, is featured in Planet Word. I wondered if this might be a good opportunity to listen to a 2-minute clip of his speech and see if we can notice any of the techniques that we identified in President Biden's speech in this speech. We might be able to make kind of a meaningful comparison. So I'm going to attempt to play a video clip. Well, hopefully it won't cause a lot of lag. If it does, we can stop, but let's try it. And then we'll see in the chat where we saw any of the techniques that we observed or talked about with President Biden.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
So I wonder, when you were listening to that, did you notice any of these same techniques that we talked about, that we observed when listening to Biden's speech? Curious, what did you see? What did you observe? Feel free to drop those in the chat if you see any. If you observed any, if you heard any. Chiasmus, my new favorite word. Exactly. That's a really famous example. Ask not what the country can do for you, but for what you can do for your country. Exactly. You might also have witnessed some dramatic pauses or pauses for emphasis. The idea of young Americans' passion for service becoming a fire that will light the world, right? Metaphor of the glowing light, thank you. That's the metaphor. And we also have a call to action in this. So you'll see when you read inaugural addresses that many themes will repeat across ages. So my friends, thank you so much for joining me today as we reflected on some of the techniques and the tips of writing and of delivery that we see resonate from President Biden's speech today to others. That's not what I wanted. There we go. So with that, I just want to ask you, how will you choose to use your words? And with that, I thank you, and I'm going to pass it back over to Katie.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. I also just want to point out again to everybody listening that Caitlin spent the 50 minutes in between listening to Biden's address and then doing this presentation, combing through it and preparing this very real-time relevant presentation for all of us. So thank you so much. Coming up, we have our second guest speaker on the main stage, and that will happen after a 10-minute break. So we will see you guys there right at 1:55. And then after that, there will be a second round of sessions starting at 2:30. So if you wanted to see one of the other educational partners present their sessions, that would be a good time to tune in to a different one. Thank you all so much, and we will see you soon. Caitlin,
Thanks,
thank you
everyone.
again.
Have a good day.
You too.